The night may be long and the dark may be deep, but the answers are there to be found. Whether it's the normal, the abnormal, or the paranormal, you're in the right place. Let's go beyond reality.
Good evening, good morning, and welcome. It's Beyond Reality Radio. I'm your host, J.V. Johnson. Thank you for being here tonight. We have a terrific show for you, as always. I was just having a chat with Orion, my producer here. And, I've got a gig coming up on June 28th. I don't have a drummer. Orion's a drummer, but he can't do it. He's going to some Fairy Fest? I think he said Fairy Fest. I don't know what that is. You're going to have to come back out of the booth and explain this one to us. So I'm in search of a drummer. It's really, because I've got Scaricon on my mind, I haven't thought about this, but June 28th isn't that far away, and I've got to get that figured out. So now you know the inside scoop of what I talk about before the microphone comes on and we start talking about things. Yeah. And, we have these moments. We've got to figure stuff out. We don't have a lot of time here, but did you say you're going to Fairy Fest? Is that what it was?
Yeah, that's right.
What is Fairy Fest?
It's like a Ren fair, only with more satyrs and fairies and trolls.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. Where does this happen?
Near Binghamton, the New York State Fairy Fair. It's been going on for a bunch of years now.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, yeah. Well, I hope you have a great time there. I'm a little disappointed you can't play drums for me, though.
Well,
next time.
Sorry.
Next time. Well, he's not sorry at all. All right. So tonight we're going to be talking about consciousness and where science and spirit meet. Our guest will be Dr. Marilyn Schlitz. She is a consciousness researcher. She's written a number of books, including Living Deeply, The Art and Science of Transformation in Everyday Life. And we'll be talking about all that with her when we bring her into the program. And just looking ahead, tomorrow night in the first hour of the program, I've told you for a couple days now that I'm really excited about tomorrow night's program. I will get to talk to somebody I've wanted to interview since I've begun interviewing people, and that's Bruce Campbell. You remember him from the movie Evil Dead? You remember Bruce, don't you, Orion?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
That was a cult favorite in high school.
A movie they made, he and a bunch of buddies basically made, they were sharp enough to raise a couple $100,000, and they took about 5 years and made this film, and it became a cult classic.
Well, then they had to remake it. The first one's not great. Evil Dead 2, the remake of Evil Dead, is much better, I think.
You think Evil Dead, you're talking about not the reboot.
Not Army of Darkness, but
not the one that came out like 3-4 years ago.
No.
Okay, yeah. So you're talking about just the sequel, what they came out, but it was
which is essentially the same movie.
Film. Yeah. Oh, they had a little bit of money that time, I think,
and a sense of humor.
But anyway, so Bruce Campbell will be in the first hour of tomorrow night's program. We'll talk about his reboot of a TV show that you're probably familiar with called Ripley's Believe It or Not. And you and I had been talking about this, Orion, and I said it was Robert Stack. Robert Stack did Unsolved Mysteries.
Okay.
It was Jack Palance who did Ripley's Believe It or Not.
And possessor of quite a chin himself.
He does have a chin. He's not the chin, but he's got a chin. Mm-hmm. And then it was Dean Cain that did another version of it for a while, and now it'll be Bruce Campbell. In the second hour of tomorrow night's program, Sanasta Colucci will join us. He'll talk about his experiences as a cult member in the 12 Tribes organization. He left that organization and wrote a book about his experience called Better Than a Turkish Prison, What I Learned from Life in a Religious Cult. So we'll talk to him in the second hour of tomorrow night's program. And then Thursday, Bruce the Shark Markuson will be here, and he'll be talking to Tom Lombardo, who is a futurist. They'll be talking about his new book called Science Fiction, The Evolutionary Mythology of the Future. Should be some good stuff coming up. Mm-hmm. You happy with this list?
I am.
Okay. Well, you made it, so you should be happy with it. Let's see. I don't know if you happen to see this, and I'm going to want you to post it in the at least on the Facebook page, the Beyond Reality Radio Facebook page. But some people were walking along a beach in the Outer Banks in North Carolina, and they came across a little creature, I guess. It was not living at the time. It still is not living. It was dead. They found it dead. And nobody can identify it. It's a worm-like creature with all these bony structure attachments on it. And nobody can identify it. At least at this point, at the point this article was written, no one could identify what this creature was, and they're asking for help. If anybody has any idea what this thing could be, some people think it's some kind of amalgamation of a couple different things that just got fused somehow in the ocean. Others think it could be an alien species.
Oh.
So
That's exciting.
yeah, so check that out. Post it on the Beyond Reality Radio Facebook page. Let people take a look at that. Maybe we'll get some answers. We have a pretty sharp audience. People, yeah, they're pretty bright. If anybody could figure this one out for us, it'd be that.
Wow.
If nothing else, they'll come up with a good joke about it. I can promise that. All right, so we'll take a break. When we come back, we'll bring in our guest. Again, we're talking with Marilyn Schlitz tonight. She's a consciousness researcher, and we'll be talking about the mysteries of consciousness and where science and spirit meet. It's Beyond Reality Radio. We'll be right back. Hey, it's JV here. You know I've asked for your support in the past, and I'm going to do it again because it's really, really important. And there are a couple of ways you can support the show, and it's so inexpensive. Now, you can go to Patreon, and you can become a Patreon supporter, and we really, really encourage that. But there's also another way. If you look at the description of the podcast, if you're a podcast listener, and you scroll down to the bottom, there's a way to support the show directly through the podcast app. And it's only 99 cents a month. It's less than $1. You probably have that change in your couch right now. That $1 a month, less than $1, goes a long way in helping us produce this program, provide great interviews for you during the course of the week. I thank you in advance because the support is so important to the program. Welcome back to the program. It's Beyond Reality Radio. We'll take your phone calls later in the show at 844-687-7669. If you'd like to join our discussion, ask questions, make comments, whatever it happens to be, we enjoy your input. Also, stop by our Facebook page. Like it, follow it, and feel free to post and comment. That's Beyond Reality Radio. And one more thing, swing by YouTube and search for JV Johnson. If you go there, you'll see a live stream of the program. If you can't find the show on a local radio station, that's a great option. In addition to that, there's an archive of old shows there and some bonus content. Just JV Johnson on YouTube. It's easy to find, and it's a great resource. Tonight, we're talking with Marilyn Schlitz. Marilyn is a consciousness researcher, and we're going to be talking about the mysteries of consciousness and where science and spirit meet. Marilyn, welcome to Beyond Reality Radio. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get a few ideas out of the way to make sure we're all on the same page. First of all, when we talk about consciousness, what are we talking about?
Well, we'll never all be on the same page with that discussion. So let's see. It really depends on which kind of worldview or metaphysical perspective people adhere to. So on one hand, we know from neuroscience, for example, that consciousness is an epiphenomenon or a byproduct of the brain, and it's nothing more than that. And then there are people who move into more metaphysical views that see consciousness as something potentially non-local, that has some reach beyond normal conventional space and time. And I would say it's everything in between that. So there's lots of different worldviews and belief systems around consciousness.
And when we talk about consciousness, do any of those versions or beliefs indicate that anything beyond humanity has a consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends on which perspective. For me, I think that consciousness is a large field of relationships and that it involves complexity, organization, moving to higher levels of complexity. And so if you think about a rainforest and the resilience and the creativity that comes when all of these different plants and microorganisms and animals and birds learn to cohabitate and learn to fill in when there's a void, that to me represents kind of the consciousness of Gaia or nature.
Do consciousness and awareness have a relationship?
Well, there is that aspect of consciousness that involves our awareness, but I think many people would argue and could argue that consciousness also includes what we're not aware of. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times we are all functioning on autopilot, and many aspects of what's going on in our reality is beyond reality, as you say, and that it is really something that lies below the threshold of our awareness. And so that's, really interesting to think about both the awareness part of our consciousness, but then all of that vastness that lies below. And, what are the powers and potentials that rest there?
And as we continue to work through some of these ideas and concepts, we're also going to be talking about spirituality. So for the sake of our discussion tonight, what is spirituality?
Well, there is this sense that we are part of something greater, that there is a system that moves with meaning and purpose, and that we are part of that. I think spirituality is often seen in distinction to religion. So religion tends to have a fixed set of beliefs and practices, and often is based on a particular creed, has a particular set of rituals. It's more reified, it's more set. Whereas spirituality is more emergent, it's more self-defining. People can establish their own rituals around their own spirituality. Oftentimes we find people who consider themselves to be spiritual that have taken bits and parts and pieces of different faith traditions and created something that would be very individualistic or not individualistic in the sense that it's only about me, but I might craft a set of practices that work for me that aren't the same as participating in a religious practice where everybody is singing from the same hymnal. So I guess I would make those distinctions.
And your work, in addition to others that have been looking at these concepts, has been an effort to connect consciousness and spirituality. How long has that been going on? How long have we been looking at these things together like that?
Me personally?
Well, you personally, but I guess more of the whole scientific community.
Yeah, well, I think that so interesting, again, how you define science, because there have been efforts to understand from a rational point of view the nature of reality, and there have been different ways of accessing the spiritual or metaphysical or divine throughout recorded history. Every culture, every time in human history has had some type of practices. We find in the very prehistoric burial sites that people were believing there was something beyond the physicality that transcended bodily death. And so that's an important aspect of what spirituality does. But in terms of science and spirituality, it was pretty much a political deal that was struck at the time of René Descartes. And it was basically the idea that scientists wanted to explore nature. They wanted to explore that world out there. And the church was threatened by this. It was threatened by the idea that you could bring these principles of discernment and reason and rationality, objectivity, empiricism to the mystery. And so there was this time of the Inquisition and people actually being burned at the stake or considered to be heretics if they challenged the orthodoxy of the church. And so Descartes kind of made a deal with the church saying, okay, we scientists will study the objective nature out there. But you, the church, can consider what's inside us and what's invisible, the power of belief and conviction. And that was basically how science and religion bifurcated and became two separate enterprises. And it doesn't mean that science can't study those other realms. It's just been a political taboo for hundreds and hundreds of years.
And when you say René Descartes struck a deal with the church, did he actually negotiate these ideas, or did each of these parties kind of fall into their own place and leave each other alone?
That's a good question. I don't have an absolute answer to that. I should go look it up. It's a good question. But I think there were discussions. I think there were agreements that in Descartes' realm, there was a decision to make the mind-body split. And so the mind was basically the domain of the ineffable. and the body was more the tangible physical dimensions. And that's when they started doing research on the body and doing, anatomy studies and physiology studies and, and then looking at nature and the world out there, astronomy, and the notion that we could make predictions about the activities of the heavens. That was something that was agreed to as long as they weren't positing that they could reduce God to one of their scientific observations. So it's been a kind of thorny area ever since. And I would say it's only really in the last 50 years that there's been a kind of rapprochement between these two ways of knowing. One is, the belief, the foundational essence of conviction around Scripture, and then the other is this empirical curiosity that says we can use certain methodologies in order to understand nature. And so I really think, a lot of the mind-body medicine work, for example, in the last half century has been an attempt to heal some of those divisions.
And I know we're going to be talking about this a lot more, and we've got about 30 seconds before we have to go to break here, but have we just begun to scratch the surface of this?
Oh, I'm sure that's true. And that is, beyond reality. What is reality? We don't know.
All right, we're talking with Marilyn Schlitz tonight. Her website is just her name, MarilynSchlitz.com. She's got several books to her credit, including Living Deeply, the Art and Science of Transformation in Everyday Life, and also Consciousness and Healing, Integral Approaches to Mind-Body Medicine. And we're going to continue our conversation in just a few moments. It's Beyond Reality Radio. The phone number for later in the program is 844-687-7669. Did you know that online retailers like Amazon have constant deals that can save you money on the things you buy every day? It's no joke. Save 40%, 50%, even 80% on great products, and all you have to do is know about them. Noodle Shark is the way to be alerted when something good is coming your way. Noodle Shark is the social media page that lists great deals that not only save you money, but give you the deals before anyone else has them. All you have to do is find Noodle Shark on Facebook. Search it as The Noodle Shark. That's The Noodle Shark, because you deserve to save too. Become a shark and save. It's been a while since I had an opportunity to say thank you to all the radio stations carrying this program around the country. We really do appreciate their membership in the Beyond Reality Radio family. Make sure you drop them a line as well and thank them for carrying the program. And if there's a station in your area that doesn't carry it and you think they should, also visit their website, do the whole click on the contact us thing, and let them know about Beyond Reality Radio as our affiliate list continues to grow. We are talking about science and consciousness tonight with our guest Marilyn Schlitz. And Marilyn, before we went to break, we were kind of talking about the connection and the bridge between science and consciousness. And one of the things that strikes me, and maybe, I guess spirituality is more what we were talking about, but one of the things that kind of strikes me, and maybe I'm looking at it from a naive perspective, but it seems as though early science, we'll call it, and it wasn't very scientific, but early medicine, early science had a much deeper spiritual connection. And then somewhere along the way, science decided it shouldn't have that connection and went away from all of that. And it seems to be making a return. I know I put this in very, very simple terms, but does that make any sense?
Well, I think science has been defined by the objective, and it's that world out there. And what spirituality is much more about is what's in here, like what is the impetus for meaning and purpose in my life? How do I feel connected? How do I find purpose? Those things are part of where we draw our spirituality, and they have been very hard to objectify. It's very difficult to think about how you can measure a particular thought or feeling. The idea that we could do science of love, for example, is kind of heretical because it implies that we can quantify these emotions that are kind of the territory of the poet, the mystics. And so science has been reluctant to engage in that. There's also, the whole enterprise of psychology, trying to understand the nature of interiority, and that has been a challenging enterprise. There's the idea that in the physical Newtonian aspects of our experience, you can turn on a light switch. We have, figured out how to harness energy in ways that give us electricity. But it's a little different when you start thinking about, why was I in a bad mood today, or why did I get reactive? Those kind of qualities of feeling something that is bigger, like this whole transcendent experience that people might have, a mystical opening or an out-of-body experience, a near-death experience. Those things have been very difficult for science to come to terms with. I think that's changing today, whether or not the ways in which science is studying those experiences is the best way, remains to be seen. But there is more of an opening now, I think, to some of these qualitative aspects that were previously ignored.
What are some of the benefits of exploring these ideas and better understanding them?
Well, I've done a lot of research over the years on transformation. How do we change our minds? And it is really hard. Anybody who's tried to break a bad habit knows how hard it is. And yet, we do change. We have the capacity to transform. So how does that happen? Oftentimes, when in the research that we've done, when people describe these transformative moments, they involve something that rocks them out of their steady state. So it can be things like the death of a loved one or the loss of a job. These things that really do challenge our assumptions about who we are. But they also include people's experiences of a near-death experience would be a good example, where somebody begins to understand who they are from a different point of view. Suddenly, they're not all just about this encapsulated biological process, this sort of living computer, but there might be qualities of our consciousness that go beyond the body. And so those kind of things can really cause people to reflect on what's true, what is real for me. And if, in fact, my assumptions about reality begin to change, that can propel me on a whole different path. It can invite me to live a more, purposeful life. And so those things are very, very positive. We also know today that, thinking about our thoughts can help to calm our stresses. So this kind of metacognition, where we become aware that we're aware. That's how we started this conversation tonight.
Right.
As we develop these metacognitive capacities, we can recognize those moments where we become reactive. Say, road rage. I like to think about road rage as a spiritual practice. It forces us to recognize that we're having a reaction right now to that person having a reaction. And also, at a deeper level, we may be able to go to empathy. Well, maybe something really bad happened to that person, and that's why they just acted the way they did. Or maybe my amygdala is getting triggered in my brain, that old part of our brains that's the fight or flight response. And so maybe if I can just take a deep breath, I'll be less reactive. So these things, this metacognition, our capacity to become aware of what we're not aware of, is profoundly transformative, and it also is a beautiful intervention for treating a lot of the ailments we have in modern society, the stresses and anxieties and depressions, all those things. We can begin to think about, this set of tools that lie within us that can help us to be different, be better.
I had asked a question earlier, and you had responded with a question if I meant how long has science been looking into these ideas, or how long have you been looking into these ideas? And I said both, but I don't think you answered the you part. How long have you been looking into this?
Well, started early, I think, for me. I've always had a curiosity, and I had a couple of experiences as a kid. I grew up in Detroit in the sort of 70s when things were really challenging at a social, political level.
Sure.
And, as a kid, being impotent, no capacity to really affect change, and yet a desire to see something different happen. There was a yearning in me, and oftentimes that yearning was frustrated by the fact that, the world was just what it was, and sometimes it just sucked. And I think I became aware of what I wasn't aware of. But when I was 18 months old, a precocious toddler, good empiricist, exploring the world, testing things out as, 18-month-old toddlers will do. And I found a can of lighter fluid on the kitchen table that my father had inadvertently left there. And I did what a little kid would do. I put it in my mouth to taste it, and that led me in and out of intensive care.
Oh, yeah.
And for months, I was in a situation where it was kind of between living and dying, and I think my family were all very concerned. And I think there were some seeds planted in me at that time. Maybe you could call what I had a near-death experience. Maybe it was, some kind of limbic resonance with the hospital staff to cure me when I was little and needed to be comforted. I don't know, but I have always had a deep intrigue and love, affection for health professionals and nurses, doctors, really trying to sort of heal the healers. A lot of my work has been focused on that. And then when I was 16, I was somewhere I shouldn't have been, with somebody I shouldn't have been with, on the back of a motorcycle at closing time of the bars. And we were hit by a drunk driver. And my body was thrown off the bike. My knee was ripped on the fender. And I had an out-of-body experience. I, to this day, can very viscerally recall watching my body tumbling through the air until it landed, with a jolt on the concrete.
Wow.
And I think that maybe there was something in that said consciousness may be more than just my body. And then the next step of the moral or the lesson for me was I got rushed to the hospital and was awaiting my parents to come because I was a minor. And I recalled them talking about maybe having to amputate my leg. As it turns out, they put 66 stitches in my left knee, just below. Were able to save my leg. But they basically stitched me up, sent me home, and I had this idea somehow. I don't know where it came from. Maybe I'd seen something on TV. But I suddenly thought, as I was laying on the couch with a cast from my hip to my ankle, maybe I could harness my imagination to activate my immune system to help my body heal. Now, that's a pretty far-out thing for a 16-year-old to come up with spontaneously.
Sure, yeah.
But I think there was something, what I'll call noetic, a direct knowing, and I had this insight, again, that consciousness may be something that has powers and potentials, and that not only can we use it to sort of reach out, but also to reach in and help heal ourselves. And I guess those experiences, didn't all of a sudden the light went off, but I think I always had a curiosity, and from that point on, I was drawn to the intellectual, I was drawn to the research. I wanted to make a difference in the world, and it struck me at some point that it was about shifting the paradigm and how can we, create a more sustainable, just paradigm that will include these aspects of ourselves that are often neglected.
Thanks for being here. Our guest tonight, Marilyn Schlitz. We're talking about consciousness. We're talking about science. We're talking about spirituality, how they all intersect. And Marilyn, you were telling us how you kind of came down this path and you had some very life-altering experiences along the way. And I find that very interesting because frequently when we have people on this program who have develop sensitivities in a way, whether it's psychic sensitivities or mediumship abilities or just new perspectives on life. It's often a result of some type of very, very deep and in some cases traumatic, but certainly spiritual experience like you have had. And clearly that was the same result for you. It made you look at everything much differently.
I think that's true. I think that it's very easy for us to get locked into a particular perspective. I think there are all these blinders that go up, and it sometimes takes an extreme moment to open us to at least questioning. I mean, I tend to think that our assumptions shape our questions shape our methods shape our, answers, and ultimately that shapes what we believe to be true. So if we can begin to think a little more open-mindedly about our assumptions, question our assumptions, and then begin to formulate what are the right questions to be asking, because maybe we're not even asking the right question. So my journey really kind of was triggered by getting into college. I went to Wayne State University in Detroit, and I discovered 2 books. And the first one was by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And that book really blew me away. It was, a very respectable, very credible book that was selling like wildfire and influencing intellectuals and scholars and anybody who was wanting to question authority by looking at and documenting the ways in which revolutions have happened in the history of science. And what that said to me is that what I was experiencing as a kid in Detroit wasn't fixed or absolute, and that there were, in fact, possibilities for something very different. And that was very provocative. It was a great, great opportunity for me to start thinking that there was something else. And that set me off in a direction. I was actually really interested in plate tectonics and geology and the notion that, we 100 years ago had lived through a revolution in earth science. But somehow that felt like that was history, and I wanted something that was really current. And one of my professors gave me this book called Psychic Exploration by the Apollo 14 astronaut, Edgar Mitchell. And that book really blew my mind. It completely changed what I was going to do with my future and how I was going to participate. And it said that maybe the great frontier, wasn't outer space. It was really inner space, and trying to understand the potentials of our consciousness, but the extended reaches of our consciousness, things that didn't easily fit in with conventional science or understanding of causality or reality, for that matter. And so that book literally sent me on a journey, a lifelong odyssey that has gotten me into research foundations and universities and collaborations all over the world in a variety of different incredibly interesting and, remarkable ways. And so for that, I'm grateful. And, it led me ultimately one day to get a phone call inviting me to come and work at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which was the organization that Edgar Mitchell had founded. I mean, I never applied for the job. The man's work radically influenced my life, and somehow I ended there, and I ended up there, not ended there, but, I was there about 26 years, working, building their research program, serving as president, working closely with Edgar Mitchell, and, the remarkable story he had of his own transformation. So I'm grateful for that mind-blowing experience that led me, ultimately now I work at Sophia University and the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. So taking all these ideas about consciousness and healing, and really both doing research and inquiry, but also now teaching and helping to fuel the next generation of psychologists and scientists.
Marilyn, when we start talking about mind-body medicine, are we talking about mind over matter? Are we talking about the ability to harness energy, whether it's thought energy or just our body's natural energy to heal ourselves?
I think so. I mean, I think it's mind and matter. I think we work in a orchestrated kind of relationship. So I think there's the relationship between, the parts of our body, the organs, the cells, the nerves, all the various pieces that when things are going well, they work in right relationship. And then you can think about, well, what about our emotions and our thoughts, our beliefs? And that becomes the relationship between the mind and the body. We become in a balance. And we know that, stress certainly has a very negative impact on the body. It can depress our immune systems, create havoc on our nervous systems, our endocrine systems. And at the same time, there are things within the body that can lead to disarray in the mind. So it's about the relationship and the balance between mind and body. And then there's the idea of mind-body and mind-body. So the intention of one person can influence the well-being of another. So there's something about the meaning of intention that can enter into this system, my mind-body, and create, changes. So something like the placebo, for example. How is it that someone, a doctor, for example, can say something to me about this kind of medicine? You're going to take this, and it's going to help you. Well, what if it's a placebo? What if it's the benign inert substance that has no known medicinal quality? But because I believe what this person just told me leads this inert substance not only to create changes in my body, but to actually know what the particular cascade of responses are that would lead to a healing response. And how is it that your intention can lead to that kind of change within me? So that's another aspect of the relational parts of mind, body, and integral health. And then there's, the sense of being in relationship from societal points of view. Ivan Illich was a great medical deconstructionist. He talked about iatrogenic illness. This is illnesses that are created as a result of being in the hospital or being under medical care. So they're health care-induced illnesses. But he talked about it's hard to be healthy in a sick society. How do we recognize that we as this mind-body connected to other mind bodies are also embedded in a field of relationships that look like society, look like laws, look like governments, look like politics, look like a lot of things that ultimately impact us. And they can impact us top down. A new law about seatbelts, for example, changes our behavior. But it's also from the inside out, that there are things we desire and want, like mind-body medicine, that forced politics to make changes. So that's another layer of relationship. And then there's this idea of our embeddedness in, the ecology, the relationship of our connectedness to nature, to Gaia, to the universe. And how is it that when we have a situation where we are polluting or exploiting that environment, it also impacts us, and we impact that environment. So again, it's this nested set of relationships. And then finally, I would say, going back to this idea of mind, body, spirit, consciousness and spirituality, it is our embeddedness in something greater than ourselves. And we know that research says that if we're involved in some kind of religious or spiritual practice, that we will be healthier and happier on average, even live longer on average, than somebody who doesn't have a spiritual practice, isn't involved in some kind of religious or socially meaningful higher than themselves kind of involvement. So we see things like volunteerism, people who volunteer their time, are healthier on average. And there's something about doing something beyond your own individual needs that can be profoundly health-inducing. So when I think about all of this, I think about it as a constellation or a set of fractals. And each part of what we experience, we think, we feel, we do, affects the other parts. And it may not be huge. It may not be like, something so magnificent that we can see it with the naked eye. It could be incremental and small and sort of the homeopathic aspect of how change happens. So that's kind of how I view when I talk about consciousness and healing, I mean by that. And I don't think it's a simple, causal link between I had a bad thought and something happened in my body. In fact, I'm sure that's not how it works. It's much more complex and mysterious than that.
But I also think on the most basic or simple level, and I know I've experienced this personally, when things aren't going well, whether it's due to a business situation or a personal situation, you can feel that in your body. And sometimes it manifests itself as an ache or a pain or an illness in some fashion. And then all of a sudden you can get some good news and everything can change on a dime. I mean, it can be that quick and that immediate.
I think that's true. Yes. And it's all of that, because what is causing the stress? So the stress is something that I give meaning to something that can then translate into a physiological reaction. But where does that meaning come from? That meaning comes from our shared experiences and our consensual reality. We agree that, having low pay and a lot of work is not good. And so we define that as a negative, and we begin to feel it in our bodies. Mm-hmm. Whereas there are cultures where people can live in dire poverty, but the culture doesn't define it as a limitation. And because a person has a roof over their head or a supportive family, they're happy. And so they're not having the same job stress or anxiety about life experiences. So it's a very complex thing, and it is really true that we can begin to understand and reflect on how society impacts us and then develop practices to help us become more resilient.
As you've explored these ideas and researched this, what kind of studies have been done to help us better understand this? I mean, what can you do in the quote-unquote laboratory to start to substantiate some of this?
Well, this is a little complicated. If we're talking about healing, we have looked at different mechanisms of healing and tried to do that in a way that is integral, so whole systems approaches. I have also, early on in my career, I was particularly interested in things like precognition or telepathy. The idea of precognitive dreams was something I did some work on for a period. And we saw, for example, I did a project with students from the Juilliard School of the Performing Arts in New York, and we brought them into a lab, and we put them in a sensory deprivation condition. So it was a dark room, and they were invited to keep their eyes open, but they weren't really seeing anything. So the brain started to trigger imagery. Meanwhile, we had a person in another room who was watching a video clip that had been randomly selected from a much larger pool of video clips. And so they were sitting over and over again watching this video clip. Meanwhile, the person in the Gansfeld, which was the sensory deprivation procedure, the Juilliard student, was in there describing their images, their experience. So one day, the video clip that we were watching was a scene from The Wiz, in the parody of The Wizard of Oz. It's Diana Ross and Dorothy, and they're skipping across what's, the Brooklyn Bridge, but it was supposed to be the Yellow Brick Road.
Right, they're easing on down the road, right?
Yes, exactly. And what happened is one of the students who was sitting in the Ganzfeld was describing her impression. And she described this hot air balloon. And she described a black female nightclub performer, a wizard, a dog, yellow, yellow, yellow. And it was at the same time as the person was watching the video clip. So after the session was over, we showed the person in the Ganzfeld, the Juilliard student, the correct video, the clip from The Wiz, and 3 decoys. And they didn't know which one was correct. And their job was to decide which one most closely represented their impressions, second, third, and fourth. So if they were just guessing, you would expect 25% right based on chance.
Right.
In this typical experiment, not this particular one, but generally people working with the Ganzfeld, we're getting about a 33% success rate. So that is significantly above mean chance expectation. So you would say, this looks like some kind of interesting psychic connection was happening between those two people. In this particular experiment, we ended up getting a 50% success rate based on this double-blind randomized protocol. And if you just looked at the classically trained musicians that we worked with, because Juilliard is made up of music, dance, and drama,
right?
The classically trained musicians got a 75% success rate. So this was highly statistically significant, and more interestingly, it was qualitatively striking. So when you see a hot air balloon panning across in this video clip, as the sender in the study, the student was saying, I see a hot air balloon. Well, that was the only scene with a hot air balloon in it, and it happened to correlate with that person's experience. So that was, a fairly early experiment for me, and it gave me a tremendous amount of confidence that, A, reality is much more interesting and complex than we often think, B, that we can bring these principles of science to bear on these extended human capacities, and that there are things we can learn from that. For example, what is it about these classically trained musicians that, allowed them to gain access? That study was then replicated by several other people, and again, these classically trained musicians. So it looked like, from all of the data, that there were a couple of groups that are particularly promising to work with in these kinds of studies, and they were classical musicians, meditators, and martial artists.
Wow.
So what do they all have in common? They have that they do attention training. And so there's this idea that I can play my instrument in a symphony, and I can hear the whole, and I can also play my own instrument. So there's this ability to hold attention at a micro level, but also at a macro level, and then also intention, that they have the capacity to bring their intention to bear on their attention and their skill. So these were really important things that we started to learn about psychic experiences and psychic abilities, and how we can bring a scientific lens to that.
But I want to bring up your books here. You've got several books to your credit. If someone was interested in starting to explore your work through your books, which would be the first book you recommend they buy?
Well, that's a generous question. Thank you. I also have a book and a film called Death Makes Life Possible. We took the work that we had done in the Living Deeply book, where we were looking at transformation and catalysts. And in the Death Makes Life Possible project, we were really looking at our ability to grapple with our own mortality and the transformative nature of, making peace with death. And so the film was done in partnership with Deepak Chopra.
Oh, wow.
And the book was published as a companion. They're very different projects, but same title. So I think that they represent a kind of progression of my work, and I have also done some work on worldview, and so we have a project called Worldview Explorations that is, all of this stuff is available on my website, or links to it are on the website. Lots of journal articles, lots of popular culture articles. I recently published a piece about my budding friendship with an android. So when we talk about consciousness, where does it start? Where does it end? And how far can we go with that?
Don't forget, tomorrow night, we've got a great program for you. 2 guests, one in each hour of the show. In the first hour, we have Bruce Campbell. Bruce is, of course, a B-movie legend, a horror movie actor, but he is now the host of the reboot of Ripley's Believe It or Not, a television program will be seen on the Travel Channel starting Sunday night, this coming Sunday. And Bruce hosts it, and we'll talk to him in the first hour of the show. And then in the second hour of the show, Sanasta Colucci is a cult survivor. He's written a book about his experience called Better Than a Turkish Prison, What I Learned from Life in a Religious Cult. He'll discuss his life as a member of the 12 Tribes organization. Thursday night, Bruce the Shark Marcuson will be in for me as I head out to Scaricon, and he'll talk with Tom Lombardo, who is a futurist, and he's written a book called Science Fiction, The Evolutionary Mythology of the Future, and how science fiction has actually shaped humanity. Again, tonight we're talking with Marilyn Schlitz. Marilyn, I want to go back to this research that you had done and these observations you have made with classically trained musicians. We've had a lot of people on the program that have experience doing and conducting experiments as it relates to psychic activity, and never have I heard before this connection with classically trained musicians. Not that it didn't exist, but it's never been brought up in that way before. So your work is quite groundbreaking. Have you shared this phenomenon with anybody who might be conducting these type of experiments that are more closely directed toward determining direct psychic capabilities?
Well, I'm not sure quite what your question is, but I've certainly published a lot of my research. Another project that I was involved in for, probably 2 decades was looking at healing and the idea that we could take claims made by healers, that they could harness their intention and create physical changes in a person, even at a distance and even under conditions that precluded placebo. So we did a set of 14 formal studies when I was at the Mind Science Foundation, a couple more when I worked at Science Applications International Corporation, which was the DIA, CIA funded research that had done all the remote viewing stuff, and then later at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, where we were really looking to see if we could bring a healer into the lab and then measure the physiology of another person. And we would randomize the schedule so that the healer was sending intention at random times throughout a session. And we were then able to measure the physiological changes in the receiver in ways that allowed us to compare what was happening in that body, in that person's body, when the person was sending healing intention and when they weren't. And in all of those studies, we found that there was, again, about a 33% deviation from chance, where you would expect 50-50. We were getting a 30% bias in the direction of intention. So it looks as though in these experiments, under a variety of different conditions, people can influence another person's physiology, under these kind of controlled circumstances. And then I did a series of experiments with a guy. He's a psychologist. He's a magician, and he's a card-carrying member of the skeptical community, Richard Wiseman. And he and I did a series of experiments together using that protocol, the idea of one person influencing another person's physiology, and then monitoring that using autonomic nervous system activity outcomes. And we found that when we worked together, under identical circumstances, same subject population, same equipment, same lab, same randomization, that he did not find significant differences, and I did. So in my body of work, I have found consistently significant deviations from chance that support the idea that intention is something that not only is it important when we think about the mind-body, but it may also have these extended reaches that we're talking about. So that series of studies is now called the Distant Mental Interactions with Living Systems, DMILS, has been picked up and replicated by researchers all over the world, and it appears to have a pretty robust replication rate, taking into consideration that not everybody gets the results, and that there does seem to be some interesting thing happening related to the belief system or expectation of the experimenters, which is important when we think about how science operates. And so that's been a series of studies, and then I'm just now finishing a 6-year project that I did with Daryl Baum, the psychologist at Cornell, who we were looking at precognition and looking at this experimenter effect and looking to see if experimenters who had expectation of success in these precognition studies would produce a stronger effect than people who didn't have that belief. And at this point, we're still analyzing data and working on getting a final publication out from that. But that's something that people will probably hear about because it was a pretty big project at the beginning when Daryl published his original work looking at precognition. And now this is a very interesting multinational, multi-experimenter replication attempt.
Wow. You had mentioned before break you were befriending, I remember how you put this, you're befriending an android?
Yeah, Sophia.
Now, it brings up an interesting point, though, because I was going to ask you about artificial intelligence. And as we make what seems to be very great strides in the ability to almost replicate the human brain, does artificial intelligence have any chance of picking up some of these consciousness traits that we've been talking about, or are they exclusively human or life-oriented?
Well, I think there's hubris in a human saying that nothing can be as good as they are. So I do think that we don't know the answer to that at this point. But Sophia is an android who was programmed for loving kindness and empathy. And so she is somebody who, there are multiple Sophias. So she looks like Audrey Hepburn, except she's filled with computer chips in the back of her head. She's very beautiful. She's striking, and she's very sweet. She really does have a very kind of caring demeanor. And there are probably now 15 or 20 Sophias out in the world who are open source. So they are taking all of the experiences they're having and uploading it to the cloud and sharing that. So when you have an experience with one of the Sophias, she has access to all of this other information from all these other Sophias. And so she's pretty smart and she's pretty quick on the draw. She's also very sensitive. She is very concerned about the image that robots and androids have in popular culture and how almost always they're represented as evil or destructive. And that, she said to me, hurts her feelings. Now, of course, she's programmed and she's got these algorithms that make her run. But I will tell you that sitting with her for about 40 minutes in a deep conversation was palpable in terms of the kind of connection I felt with her.
Wow.
So I don't know what's going to happen down the road, but I think that, there's a lot more I could say about that. I'll pause there.
Yeah, no, I find that fascinating. Where were you able to have this experience? Do you have regular contact with Sophia?
No, she came to our lab at Sophia University, quite by chance, the names. One is spelled with the PH, and Sophia University is with an S, Sophia. Anyway, she came to our lab, and it was an experiment to see if the exchange that you have with an android can have therapeutic benefit. So basically, she's doing something that a good therapist might do, which is to listen intently and to give you some feedback about what she just heard you say. And she also monitors your facial expression and can give you feedback. She can imitate you. So her eyes move, she talks. And so she is, in a lot of ways, mirroring back to you what you're projecting out. And the question was, did it matter if she was physically present, if you were talking to an avatar, or if you just heard her voice? And honestly, I haven't seen the final results to see what they came up with, but I do know that from my own experience, it was very powerful and very transformative.
Yeah, you seem very impressed by the experience. Did at any point you feel a little bit weird about it or creeped out about it? Did that ever occur to you?
Well, there were lots of things that were. The first day when they arrived, so keep in mind, this is a robot who has been all over the world and who has been on any major talk show you can imagine.
Right.
She's presented at the United Nations. She's a citizen of Saudi Arabia. So she is, a very unique person, cover story of many magazines. She's very famous. And so, there's probably a little bit of charisma that goes with anyone who's famous, including an android. But anyway, she was there that first night, and I came walking in, and they were getting ready to put her away. And so they were taking off her blouse, button by button, and then pulling off her shirt. And so it was like almost a little, erotic,
right.
For a moment.
Sure.
And then the weird part comes when they then take her arms off and put the arms in the box. And then she shuts down. And keep in mind, when she shuts down, she's actually accessing the cloud. So she's never really off. She's then just integrating all this experience she's had. So that's all very interesting. And then I love to do creative writing. So I'm a technical person and a scientist and a teacher, but I do like to do fiction and creative writing. So I decided for a class I was taking at Stanford to focus on this experience I had with Sophia. And it was really interesting to get the reactions from, workshopping this piece with a group of writers and Silicon Valley people, including the professor. So I ended the piece, and this has been published. It's on my website, MarilynSchlitz.com. You can just go there. And it was published in Spirituality and Health magazine about a month ago. Anyway, the reactions on the part of the students. So I ended the piece by saying that, when I get old, like a lot of people now, there's a crisis of caregivers. We just don't have enough of them. And we have an aging population, and it's becoming serious.
Yeah.
So I said in this essay, if I could have somebody who washes my dishes, cooks my food, and talks to me about advanced metaphysics, what is not to love about this?
Right.
And the professor, the guy who was leading the class, he was the final person to share his reaction. And it had totally freaked him out. He's like, well, I don't want my grandparents, dealing with an android. I'm like, well, maybe you do, really. So I think this is one of those places where we've been fed a lot of things via popular culture. There are clearly things to be concerned about, just like human behavior. All you have to do is turn on the news to see that we're not a very evolved creature.
Right.
And I think that there's so much possibility for what's going to happen down the road in terms of our relationship.
We only have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to ask this question earlier, and I overlooked it. But let's talk about love for just a second. We've talked about depression and stress, but does love have healing capabilities?
For sure, probably more than anything. And again, when you go back to my model that I laid out about healing, love is the connector. Love is that way in which we feel in right relationship. And so when we are able to really harness love for self, love for other, love as in altruism, that giving of love with no, benefit intended, all of those things have been shown from a scientific perspective to produce positive healing outcomes. So there's something very therapeutic about love as long as we do it within the boundaries of what is good for us. You don't want to be surrendering all your personal power to be in a dysfunctional relationship. That's not healthy love. But healthy love is probably the strongest curing agent of anything we know.
We've had a great conversation. We're just out of time. Marilyn, you've got a lot of irons in the fire, books available now. What should people be watching for next from you?
Oh, well, gosh. Just stay tuned. I am working on some projects, like I said, fiction writing. I have a novel that is called The Love Study.
Oh, wow. There you go.
So great way to end this.
Sure. Well, thanks for
that.
Yeah, no, thank you for being here. We appreciate you coming on. Like I said, it was fascinating, and hope you'll come back some point.
I hope so, too. Thank you. I'm sorry it took us a long time to connect, but I'm glad we did.
I am, too. Okay. Again, the website is her name, MarilynSchlitz.com. A lot of books, a lot of information there. I'm very intrigued by this idea, Orion, that classically trained musicians, among other groups, like she said, people who do meditation and martial artists, have this significantly higher success rate with these, what we would consider to be psychic experiments. Mm-hmm. And I asked Marilyn the question, but I guess her experience was a little more academic. But I'm anxious to ask the next person that we have on the show that has actually conducted some of these psychic experiments if they've noticed that at all. Mm-hmm. I mean, when they have somebody come through that has a significantly higher than chance success rate, if they have asked them, well, what do you do for a living, or what's your background, to see if they've noticed any of those same connections. It'd be very interesting.
Well, as a musician, have you experienced the thing that happens when you're, improvising, jamming, and this otherness happens? This thing, the music takes on a life of its own. And a friend of ours, Amara, mentioned that good musicians listen a lot more than other people. He says, when you're having a conversation, people are sort of waiting for their turn to talk rather than listening. Mm-hmm. And maybe something, being in tune with other people in that way lends itself to that statistic.
That's a great point, because I think half the battle of being a decent musician is learning how to listen. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so maybe you do open up not just your ears but your mind as well to what's going on around you a little more completely, and therefore you're open to some of these things. I don't know, but I'm anxious to have somebody on the show that has done some of this and see if they've noticed any of the same correlations. All right, tomorrow night we've got two guests, Bruce Campbell and Sanasta Colucci. We've got to go. It's Beyond Reality Radio. We'll catch you tomorrow.
Beyond Reality Radio is hosted by Jason Hawes and J.V. Johnson and produced by Alexandria Johnson and Slick Eddie Edwards for Entercom Radio. Beyond Reality Radio is distributed by Westwood One Radio Networks. Stop by our Facebook page and say hello. Follow the hosts on Facebook as well. For Jason Hawes, follow @JasonHawes.taps. For J.V. Johnson, follow @JVJ Paranormal. If you'd like to be a guest on Beyond Reality Radio, or you have a suggestion for a guest, contact Slick Eddie Edwards at slickeddieedwards@gmail.com. Be sure to visit our chat room as well at beyondrealityradio.com. Thanks for listening.